Okay, so then the question might be, well, if intelligence has to solve the problem of how to perceive and navigate within the world towards ends, in order to fulfill, in order to make the world manifest what it needs to manifest so that you can maintain yourself and stay alive, what ends is it orienting itself towards? And I think that's a good way of thinking about the traits. The traits motivate the perceptual frame. And so you might think that, well, extroverted people are after social success. And you can understand why that would be, because social success brings with it all sorts of rewards. Social failure brings costs, and you could also understand why that would frighten you away from it. And social success also requires the expenditure of effort, and introverted people seem to be much more conservative in a sense in terms of expending energy socially, and I suppose they're protecting themselves to some degree against the possibility of social failure. We don't really know. We know more about how extroverts, in some sense, how and why extroverts orient themselves the way they do in the world. We're not so sure about introverts. What it is that, what the proper landscape is for introverts. I can show you a word cloud. I'll do that at some point, that were generated from introverts on Facebook. And they seem to be into fantasy and gaming a lot. And I don't know why that is exactly, because the fantasy element should be more localized in openness, but the introverted types, I mean, I suppose they're the people that are on the Big Bang Theory, roughly speaking. You know, they seem to be the introverted types, and but we don't understand that much about them, exactly how it is that they're orienting themselves in the world. People who are high in neuroticism are oriented towards security and safety. Agreeable people versus disagreeable people are oriented, say, towards cooperation versus competition. Conscientious people are oriented towards order, duty, obligation, and implementation. And open people are oriented towards abstraction, in both ideational and in representation. And so those are also, to some degree, you might also think about those as value systems, right? Because what you value is definitely not only what you pursue. That's too narrow a view. Value is also what you perceive and pursue. And so thinking about these things as this entire frame of reference, I think, is a much better way of doing it. We talked about this earlier, this sort of structure earlier, as a micro-personality. And I mentioned the determination of micro-personalities by fundamental underlying biological systems like defensive aggression and sexual desire and hunger and thirst and so forth. Those are all systems that can grab your perceptions, make you look at the world in a certain way, make you pursue something else in a certain way, and prime action responses that are in keeping with all of that. The traits seem to be something like higher order agglomerations of those more fundamental biological motivations. Although we don't quite understand the relationship between the underlying biology and the traits, we're starting to sort it out. So we know, for example, if you look at the function of the hypothalamus regulates the basic biological motivations that I just outlined, but it's also the place where the exploratory systems find their ultimate physiological grounding, and openness and extroversion seem to be variant manifestations of the exploratory impulse, and that's grounded in the hypothalamus. So we're starting to be able to put the traits, to sort of nail the traits down to their underlying biology. And with regards to neuroticism, well, if you're high in neuroticism, you're more sensitive to anxiety, and that's regulated at least in part by the hippocampus and generated in part by the amygdala. There's another part of the brain called the periaqueductal gray that seems to be associated with the experience of pain, and pain is quite a complex phenomena. Depression is pain-like, grief is pain-like, social isolation is pain-like, disappointment is pain-like. There's anxiety components to that too. And so neuroticism seems to be something like threshold for activation in those negative emotion systems. So if you're higher in neuroticism, 1 unit of uncertainty might produce, let's say, 3 units of psychophysiological response, whereas if you're lower in neuroticism, 1 unit of uncertainty might produce 1 unit of psychophysiological response. It's hard, you know, obviously that's a simplified schemata, but there's variability because if something unexpected or threatening happens to you, it isn't obvious how upset you should get. One answer might be, brush it off, it's nothing. Another answer might be, it's a bloody catastrophe. And often when something uncertain or threatening occurs, you don't have enough information at your disposal to make a full determination of the potential import of the circumstance, especially if it's uncertain. And so then you have to guess at how upset you should be and where you are on the normal distribution with regards to trait neuroticism, say, that sort of determines what your guess on average is going to be. So, you know, the other, with conscientiousness, say, you might say, well, how hard should you work? Well, that's a really difficult question. If you're going to die tomorrow, and then you probably shouldn't work very hard today at all. So one thing you might say is that the degree to which you should work hard is dependent on your assumptions about the stability of the future. We actually know this to be true because if you put people in wildly uncertain circumstances, they discount the future, which is exactly what you should do, right? It only makes sense to store up goods for future consumption if the future is likely to be very similar to the past and the present. You need a stable society for that. And conscientiousness only works in a stable society. Because all you do otherwise, if you're piling up goods, which is kind of what conscientious people do, is leaving them there for the criminals to take, or waiting for the next chaotic upheaval to wipe out everything that you've stored. And so even conscientiousness is a kind of guess. Hard-working people say, well, you know, sacrifice the present for the future. That's great, as long as the future is going to be there and you can predict it. But if it's not going to be there and it's unpredictable, then the right response is take what you can take right now while the getting's good. Now, you know, obviously there are troubles with that too, and I'm speaking, you know, I'm offering rough rules of thumb, but I'm trying to provide you with some indication of how and why these difference in value structures exist, because they're applicable in different environments. You know, sometimes in a dangerous social environment, it's not obvious that being an extroverted person is a good idea. Because extroverted people, they stand out, especially if they're extroverted and creative, right? Because not only are they noisy and dominant and assertive, they're also colorful and flamboyant and provocative. Well, that's great if you're in a society that rewards that sort of thing, but if you have, you know, if you're ruled by an authoritarian king who wants absolutely no threat whatsoever to his stability ever, then dressing in gray and shutting the hell up is a really good survival tactic. So the utility of the trait depends on the structure of the environment that surrounds it. And that's why there's variability in traits. And so you have to be careful when you're thinking about it from a strict scientific perspective to make the assumption that positioning at any place on the normal distribution is preferable to positioning anywhere else. Now, one exception to that might be IQ. Because one of the things that you can see with IQ is that people with higher IQs seem to do better, but that's also only true in complex societies. And then there's another problem that seems to emerge with IQ, and I don't know exactly what to make of this, but we know that as women's IQ increases, the probability that they're going to remain without a mate also increases, because women tend to mate across or up dominance hierarchies. And so if you're a woman with an IQ of 130, then you've already eliminated about 95% of the men. And that's only using one criteria. That's just straight intelligence. And so there also might be limitations to the utility of intelligence with regards to reproduction that we don't really understand very well yet. So